Hello everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this webinar on how to pre-think assumptions. In this webinar, we're going to talk about pre-thinking, which is a method to come up with assumptions. It's a fairly application-focused webinar, and to make sure that you guys are well prepared for this webinar, we send this one video of 3 video lessons your way. They were an introduction to assumption, pre-thinking logical gap, as well as pre-thinking two entities. If you've not gone through these video lessons, do go through them post this webinar. This webinar combined with the knowledge that you'd get as well as the practice that you'd get within these video lessons would ensure that you'd find that your ability in solving assumptions as well as any other argument based questions would improve considerably. So I definitely recommend going through them. With that, let's kind of talk about one thing, and I'm curious. I have about 130 odd students in this webinar. I want to understand, how does coronavirus affect your GMAT preparation? Let's kind of put that over here. Here's a short answer poll. The question is, how does this coronavirus affect your GMAT preparation? Are you guys more motivated? Are you guys concerned? Are you guys not being able to motivate yourself to prepare for the test? And so on and so forth. And again, I do understand there's kind of a self-selection bias. If you're there in this webinar, then you're most likely looking to study. So there's a self-selection bias over here in the responses. But still, I'd like to get those concerns over there. Okay. Some of you are saying you got more time for your prep, you're uncertain about your MBA. Others are really saying, okay, I'm motivated. This is something that has given me time to think about it. Okay. And yes, exams have been cancelled until further notice. But the nice thing is that the cancellation fee is completely off. So I think that's something which is a slight positive. Gives time from a busy work schedule. Okay. Exam cancelled. All right, got good time to prepare. All right, so let's make the most of this time, and make sure that that you guys are well on that journey towards that high GMAT score. Thank you very much. All right, so with that, let's kind of talk about what kind of GMAT score are you guys aiming for? So what is your target GMAT score? We remove broadcast results so that we remove any bias again from the answer choices. Okay, I have 160 students now in the webinar. So let's get a few more responses. 3, 2, and 1. All right. So 730 to 750, the biggest segment over here, 760 plus, about 20% of you, a similar number in that 710 to 720 bracket, and then 600 to 700, about 14% of you are over there. So let me end the poll, and thank you very much for those responses. And when do people plan to take the test? I think I should have changed this poll in the next 15 days. There's very few. It's not possible to take the test, but then many of you haven't taken your date as of yet. That's good to know. So I'd mentioned earlier. We have some upcoming free webinars. We have a free webinar on GMAT algebra. If you've not registered for this one, click on the register now button. We have a free GMAT strategy webinar again. That's next week. If you've not registered for this one, this really helps you execute that study plan to that 760 score. Okay, the other piece over here. How many of you have created a personalized study plan? Select yes if you have a personalized study plan. Select no if you don't have a personalized study plan. Okay, let's get a few more responses. The question is, how many of you have a personalized study plan overall? 3, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll, broadcast the results. But 67% of you don't have a personalized study plan to that 730, 750, or 760 score, or that 710, 720 score overall. So let's kind of spend a few minutes talking about that, and then we're going to go right into the pre-thinking part of the webinar. So by the way, someone asked this question, which is, hey, how long would this webinar last? It's going to be about 2 hours and 10 minutes. And this webinar is being recorded, so if you have to leave, halfway into the webinar, we will send the recording your way. Okay, so essentially 3 parts of this webinar. Usually I don't do the first part, but which is an introduction to company. This essentially is the part where we talk about helping you create your own personalized study plan and tell you how are we different. But I'm going to do that intro since 67% if you don't have that. Then we're going to go right into the core of the webinar. That's going to be about 120 minutes or so. And then towards the end, if you still have questions that have not been answered and questions about how do you prepare for the test, questions about a particular aspect of the test, questions about MBA admissions, and so on and so forth, I'd be happy to answer those questions in this third open-ended Q&A part. So essentially, when you think about this, upwards of 60% of the class who is aiming for that score of 720 or higher, and statistically, when you think about it, only 6% of the people get to the score, and this is despite the fact that when you look at top B schools, and these are top B schools excluding Harvard and Stanford, the median scores have been going up and they continue to go up. This is stats across the last 4 to 5 years or so, and then this particular data point is from 2018. Okay. So what happens to students who actually get there? A good percentage of them, they use EGMatt, and so why do we say that? When you look at key stats on various forums, and you look at the number of verified reviews on GMAT Club, when you look at the number of success stories that have been posted in the last 12 months, what you're going to find is very similar stats. EGMatt accounts for more than half of the success stories. EGMatt accounts for essentially a good chunk of the reviews overall. So what makes students at EGMatt more successful? Someone actually asked the question. He says, if you have EGMatt, why do you need a personalized study plan? Why? Because every EGMatter gets his or her personalized study plan. That study plan actually helps you define which aspects of the course you should focus on, because everyone has his or her own strengths and weaknesses, and you need to know how to leverage your strengths. You need to know how much time you need to spend on your weakness, and so that's that approach to GMAT preparation that makes our students more successful. We tell you where do you need to focus your time. We tell you when you've actually hit certain milestones so that you can go from studying sentence correction to critical reasoning to number properties, and so on and so forth. Okay, so what makes us different? I think when you think about it, our approach, the architecture of learning that we provide is what makes us different. So when you think about the learning pedagogy out there, there are essentially 2 different learning architectures that you're going to see. One is what we call as the book-based architecture, and the second is the private tutoring-based architecture. When you look at most of the other online courses out there, what you're going to find is they do provide audiovisual learning, but they're built on this book-based architecture. When you look at EGMatt, we built around this private tutoring-based architecture where if you're an EGMatt student, you get personalized feedback 500 times during the course. And then I'm going to talk about one aspect of that personalization in the next 4 to 5 minutes, which is, hey, creating your study plan. So how do you get to a score of 720 or higher? I think the first thing which you have to do is create that path to the goal, which means, hey, you need to know how much time you need to study, where do you need to spend that time, what metrics you need to hit. Then you need to make sure you go towards hitting that metrics, and you need to learn the concepts that you need to learn. But just knowing those concepts isn't enough. You also need to learn how to apply those concepts, and then you need to get so good at applying those concepts that you are in that top 6%, top 4%, top 2 percentile, or top 1 percentile of students. That's kind of the journey at a very high level that you have to take. So if you're learning from a book-based architecture, how does that book-based architecture tackle these challenges? So let's start with study plans. A book-based architecture is built on what we call as uniformity. You know, when you start studying using a book, you get a couple of study plans and not personalized to your strengths or weaknesses. And essentially, you pick up one of those study plans and start learning. So you learn concepts, and books are an excellent way to learn concepts. You know, they're very comprehensive and so on and so forth. The only problem is books don't give feedback, which means when you learn a concept from a book, you don't know whether you've learned well enough because there's no inherent feedback mechanism built in there. So that burden of validation is completely on you. One area where books really struggle is to teach you how to apply those concepts. And you know, books by again with a very static architecture can't really tell you this is what you need to do in step 1, this is what you need to do in step 2, in step 3, and in step 4. So, you know, a lot of people who study using books, or a book-based architecture, they resort to mastering application by practicing hundreds or thousands of questions. Some are able to master application, but they're probably the best and the brightest. When it comes to evaluation of mastery, people who follow book-based architecture resort to taking tens of mocks. Again, when you take a mock test, you know, it's not just an arduous process. It also has variability built into it. And when you analyze it, that onus of analysis is completely on you as a student. Someone was telling me my mock scores vary a lot in the Q&A pod. They go from 600 to 720. That's what happens when you study a certain portion and you evaluate yourself on a mock test. So how does a private tutoring based architecture work? A private tutoring based architecture starts with or when you work with a good private tutor, the first thing that a good private tutor would do is to make sure that you create that personalized study plan based on your strengths and weaknesses. And if you work with a private tutor, you'd probably see that. Then a good private tutor teaches you concepts, and while you're learning concepts, a good private tutor would evaluate you constantly, giving you feedback on the areas that you need to work on. One area where working with a private tutor is probably the most effective is when it comes to application of concepts. And when you learn a few concepts, a good private tutor would help you solve questions, and it'll tell you what you need to do in step 1, what do you need to do in step 2, what do you need to do in step 3, and so on and so forth. And again, it'll point out where you're faltering. And then as you're solving more and more questions, the private tutor would figure out when you've reached a certain level of mastery so that you can go from one subsection to another. You would not need to take as many marks if you're working with a good private tutor. So what's the difference in two approaches? You're essentially learning the same content, you know, it's a GMAT that you're studying for, but the extent of personalization, the extent of feedback, the extent of precision targeting is a lot more in that private tutor-based architecture. And it's no surprise why that people who follow that private tutor-based architecture are way more successful. So let's see, why do we say, you know, we are built around that private tutor-based approach. Whereas some of the other prep companies are built around that book-based architecture. And let's kind of start off with the first piece over here, which is essentially, you know, defining that part to your goal. If you want to study towards that 720 score, you've got to figure out how are you going to get to that 720. And the case study that I'm going to really take is someone who's going to go from a 600 to a 720. But on the EGMatt platform, you can pretty much use any starting score, any ending score, up to a score of 780. Our students have built upwards of 25,000 study plans overall. So how do you build that personalized study plan? The first thing is you've got to quantify your strengths and weaknesses, which is the first point where you say quantify your starting abilities. Then you've got to define target milestones to that 720, 730 score. And then the third piece is then you need to really figure out how much of the course do you need to spend your energy on, which portion of the course are you going to do, which portion of the course are you not going to do based on your starting abilities as well as your milestones. So how do you define your starting abilities? You take a Sigma X mock. What is a Sigma X mock? It's the world's only mock which is built around the architecture of ability engine. So anyone over here knows what an ESR is, or enhanced score report on the GMAT? Anyone over here? You can say yes or no in the short answer part over here. Okay. An ESR, or an enhanced score report, is a report that you get once you take the GMAT, and it tells you your ability score. So it it doesn't just tell you your quant and verbal scores, but within verbal, it will tell you how to do an SC, CR, and RC. It will give you a percentile score. So there are two ways to get your ability scores today. One is you take the actual GMAT, which by the way today you can't, and then spend $30 to order an ESR, or you take a Sigma X mock because it's the world's only mock that allows you, that evaluates your ability in every subsection and gives you those ability scores. Why are those ability scores important? Because it tells you your strengths and weakness. Okay. So once you have those ability scores, so you can actually go there and you can actually say Sigma X. If you Google Sigma X mock, you'd get to this link as well. Once you have that, you need to set your milestones. How do you go about setting your milestones? If you go to gmatplanner.com, you actually get to a landing page where our AI-based engine will help you create that. Right now, you work with one of our counselors. You can actually set up a time slot over the next 3 days to help create your own personalized study plan, and they're going to use that. So how does this work? So this is the screenshot of GMAT Planner once you start using the tool. If you're an EGMatt student, you already have access to it. You don't need to wait for a consult. You can actually do it yourself. So it takes in your current quant and verbal scores. And this is where the scores that you'd get from an actual test or from a Sigma X mock. So you put in those scores. These are quant and verbal scores. Then it tells you a recommended quant and a recommended verbal score to hit that score of 720. If your target score is 740, 760, it will accordingly change those recommendations. This uses data based on the data from about 45,000 students who've taken the EGMatt course. So when that happens, that target score of 720 is now becomes a set of 5 milestones. It tells you if you want to get to a Q50, what ability score should you aim for in arithmetic or algebra geometry. This is, by the way, scores that are also there in your ESR, and what ability score should you aim for in SC, CR, and RC. Again, for every score, there are about 20 to 25 different combinations that are possible. This tool optimizes for the most likely combination that is there for you. So every student would get a different combination depending on your starting strengths and weaknesses. So when you do that, your GMAT preparation becomes a set of 5 different milestones, which means you're going to go from the starting milestones in quant. And where do you get these starting milestones? These starting milestones are milestones that you get from the Sigma X mock, and these are the target milestones that you get from GMAT Planner. So you have 3 starting milestones in verbal, 2 in quant, and you have corresponding target milestones. So your entire GMAT preparation becomes a set of 5 different milestones. If you hit those milestones, you hit your target GMAT score. Then it helps create a study plan based on your starting and ending abilities. And again, you can really see over here what this is really saying is, to go from a 59th percentile in arithmetic to an 83rd percentile, you need about 1.4 weeks. To go from a 50th percentile in SC to a 90th percentile or an 89th percentile, you need about 2.1 weeks of prep time. And this is based on the number of hours that you're willing to put in. So then when that happens, you're aiming for hitting those ability scores. You hit those ability scores, you hit the verbal score, you hit the quant score, and you hit correspondingly the overall GMAT score. So why did we go about? And you also get a day-by-day plan, by the way, if you need one. And again, you can really see it takes into account how many hours you can study during a weekday as well as during a weekend. What is your starting preparation date? What's your and it calculates when can you actually take the test based on that. So why did we go about spending upwards of 1,000 hours building this utility? So that each one of you can create that personalized study plan and can iterate over that personalized study plan in about 7 minutes or so. So the next thing that a private tutor does is, when you start learning concepts after you have that study plan, to give you feedback on those concepts, and we do just the same. We built our own video technology in which, as you learn concepts, we constantly evaluate you and we give you feedback. So for example, over here, the student has taken the subject verb make sense concept and he scored a 40% score, which means the student must go and revise. This time that you see over here is the time that this particular student spent, so this time on attempting that concept. Because you get that feedback as you falter while studying, you get feedback from the system to revise, and you get this feedback upwards of 500 times throughout the entire course. When you compare it with another course, this is a fairly popular course by Magoos. What you really see is, again, an organization of lessons, not as comprehensive, but again, there's no feedback over here. They're just a bunch of lessons. This time that you see is not the time that you spent on it, it's the length of the video. The other piece is application of concepts. Now remember, just knowing the concepts isn't enough. You've got to learn how to apply those concepts as well. And at EGMatt, once you learn a few concepts, we actually teach you how to apply those concepts using dedicated application files. Then we evaluate your ability to apply those concepts. Again, we give you feedback right then and there. So just when you learn subject verb, we are evaluating your ability to apply subject verb. When you learn verbs, we evaluate your ability to apply verbs as well as subject verb. Why? Because verbs are after subject verb, and so on and so forth. And this is how every module is structured. When you compare this again with the Magoos course, there is no application file. There is a quiz towards the end which contains 5 questions. That quiz is common not just to subject verb, but also to auxiliary verbs, also to pronouns, and so on and so forth. Again, the principle that they're using is just to give you practice, not to give you feedback. The next piece is evaluation of mastery, and we built a dedicated tool that allows you to do that. So, it's the world's highest rated assessment tool called Rhenium. In Rhenium, you can take an ability quiz, and when you take an ability quiz, it tells you what your ability score is going to be. So you don't need to take a mock test to really figure out your ability score, and then it tells you the areas that you need to focus on. So clearly over here, this particular student needs to focus his energy on comparison type questions to improve from that 76th percentile ability to that 90th percentile ability. So you can really see why do we say that most of the other courses are built around this book-based architecture, was EGMatt is built around that private tutoring based architecture. So again, also if you want to be among that 720 score, try the free trial out, see if that works for you. Also, if you want to connect with students at B schools, some of you were asking questions as I was doing this intro that is it a wise idea to go for a USB school considering the coming recession? We post frequently on LinkedIn about such questions. Also, I have upwards of 15,000 students who are in top B schools who are connected with me, so you can connect with them as well. The short answer to that question, by the way, is it a wise idea to go for it? I think yes. Why? Because even though, yes, and a recession may be coming, it'd still be graduating a couple of years down the time, which in my opinion is the best time to graduate. It's a really bad time for people who are graduating right now. I think my sympathies go to them, but for people who are studying now, and then for people who would be starting in fall of this year or fall of next year, I think it's going to be a really great time once they graduate. And I say that from my personal experience because that's when I did my MBA. Okay, so with that, let's go into the second part of this webinar, which is how do you ace CR using pre-thinking? So here's the short agenda. Right now, what we're going to do is we're going to discuss how you approach critical reasoning today. Then we're going to do a pre-thinking exercise overall. We're going to solve a few full-length questions as well, unofficial questions. And we're going to solve these questions as a quiz. So we're going to give you those questions. Then we're going to do a detailed review of those questions. We'll also touch upon the negation test, by the way. And then we're going to really talk about, once you get done with this, what should you do next to make sure you master pre-thinking, and then where can you get more practice. So at a very high level, we'll document how you prepare today, then we'll recognize what's important to master assumption questions, and then we'll look at where you go next from there. So let's kind of talk about what your current approach is. And before I talk about that current approach, I want to make sure I define pre-thinking absolutely clearly. Pre-thinking is thinking one potential assumption in your mind in about 15 seconds before looking at the answer choices. Now, the 3 portions in course are very, very important. I'm going to start with the first one, or actually I'm going to start with the last one, before. Pre-thinking is always done before you look at the answer choices. The moment you start looking at the answer choices, you can actually throw pre-thinking out of the window. Why? Because your mind will be corrupted by uh, by the information given in the answer choices. So pre-thinking has to be done before you start looking at the answer choices. Then let's go towards this one potential assumption. An argument can have multiple assumptions. You're not worried about all the assumptions that an argument can have. You're only worried about thinking of one potential assumption. Why? Because pre-thinking is a means, it's a tool for you to understand the logic that the author is using. The moment you understand, you're able to come up with one potential assumption, that's the moment you understand the logic. The moment you understand the logic, and if the correct answer is a different assumption, the moment you read that answer choice, you would really be able to identify that. And again, you need to do this in about 15 seconds. Now, when you're starting pre-thinking, it might take you 2 minutes to do this. But after you solve about 40 to 50 questions, and if you do them right, this is the time that it'll take you to arrive to be able to do pre-thinking for 85 to 90% of the questions. And the reason I want to make sure that you understand this is because the term pre-thinking has been there for a very long time. I mean, even before EGMatt as a company started, the word pre-thinking existed. But people often confused it with predicting the answer. Pre-thinking is not about predicting the answer. Pre-thinking is about understanding the author's logic. It's a tool to understand the logic or the reasoning that the author is using to arrive at the correct answer. Now, let's talk about the methodology that you guys use. So there are two ways in which people solve critical reasoning questions. The first way is they read the argument, they look at the answer choices and do back and forth till they reach the final candidate. And the second methodology that is there is essentially they read the argument, they pause, they pre-think the assumption, and then go to the answer choices, referring back to the argument only if needed. Let's get a few more responses. I have 190 students here in this webinar. I want to understand which methodology do you use. I have about 70 responses right now, 85 responses. Let's get to at least 120 responses. The question is, which methodology do you use? There are two options that you see, methodology 1, methodology 2. I have 111 responses, 115, 120. That is great. Thank you. Let me end the poll and broadcast the results. So typically, what I'm used to seeing that 50-50 split. That's great to know that. So half the people use methodology 1, the other half use methodology 2, and then for those of you who use methodology 2, I have another question, which is, where do you spend the biggest chunk of your time? If for those of you who use the pre-thinking approach, where do you spend the biggest chunk of your time? And the reason why I ask this question is because people who use the pre-thinking approach, they spend the biggest chunk of their time, and let me end the poll because I have most of the answers, in reading and understanding the argument. Why? Because if you do a good job in reading and understanding the argument, selecting the correct answer becomes fairly simple. By the way, if you use methodology 1, you'd spend most of the time selecting the correct answer over here, or this part, evaluating the answer choices. Second, that's the difference in the two methodologies over there. Not just the overall accuracy, but also where you spend your time arriving while solving a question. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for that participation. It just, data is really powerful. It tells you, it actually helps point to causality more often than not. Now, we're talking about assumptions here. So we need to figure out what an assumption is. And to do that, I'm going to show you a very simple argument, and an argument that's close to your heart. And I want you to tell me, what does the author assume in this particular argument? So here's the argument. Tell me, what does the author assume here? Okay, put in your answers. Don't put the answers in the Q&A pod, guys. Why? Because then others can't see those answers. The Q&A pod is just for your questions. So yeah, and again, I know that you're not seeing your answers as you put them, but I am getting them. I'm waiting for about 50 responses before I share those results. So 46, 47, 49, and I have 50 responses, and so now you should start seeing those answers. And good answers. Lots of answers are really good. One has to score more than 500 to get admission to an Ivy League college. No Ivy League school accepts a student who scores 500 or below. Okay, I like that because you say 500 or below. I like that precision. 500 is a low score to get into Ivy League college. Not as precise. Why? We don't care about 500 being a low score. We only care about Joe getting into an Ivy League college. So you can read what others have said. 73 answers again. Thank you for the participation. It helps a lot. So what's happening? The first part, the author presents a fact. He says Joe scored 500 on the GMAT. It's a data point. It's a fact. And then based on this, the author makes a claim. He says, hey, therefore he, as in Joe, will not get admission in an Ivy League college. So when he does that, he kind of makes that jump from that data point, which is a score of 500, to an admission in an Ivy League college. Okay, and while doing that, he's making that assumption over here, which is that the score of 500 for someone like Joe is unacceptable to Ivy League colleges. You guys were able to get 90% of the logic. The only place where you guys probably did not focus as much is for this on this aspect for someone like Joe. Now, some of you may think, why is it that we care about someone like Joe? Because in the conclusion, the author is talking about that Joe, he's saying, therefore, he will not get admission into an Ivy League college. The author is not saying that the Prince of Saudi Arabia will not get admission into an Ivy League college with a score of 500. So I think very, very important, but you guys get the gist of what an assumption is. Now, let's talk about the formal definition of an assumption. So I'm going to clear this poll once again, and I want you to tell me what is the formal definition of an assumption. Again, I'm going to broadcast results once I get about 40 or 50 responses over here. So what is the formal definition of an assumption? All right, I have 20 responses. Let's get a few more responses. 40 responses. Good, I'm going to broadcast results. I have some really great responses, and I have some, I would say, vague responses, which are not so great. And again, some of you given a definition that's spot on. Others have mentioned what I call as attributes of assumption, which is, hey, something that supports the conclusion, something that's a missing link, something that we have to infer, and so on and so forth. Yes, those are attributes, but that's not a formal definition of an assumption. Some of you have actually stated the precise definition, which is what an assumption is: an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to be valid. Okay. Now, I will tell you one thing. At this point in time, I would ask you, if you have a pen and paper with you, write this down. If you don't have a pen and paper with you, then essentially write this down on a Word doc or a notepad or something on the computer. Why? Because as we solve 700 level question, and we're going to solve some of the most challenging questions over there, you guys will get confused, and you're going to argue an alternate answer choice or incorrect answer choice to be correct. And I'm going to get back to this formal definition of an assumption. Critical reasoning, and in fact most aspects of the GMAT are like Newton's laws of physics. They are super precise, they are super applicable. If you understand them, you can actually build the greatest engineering wonder. And that's kind of where critical reasoning is as well. So if you understand this definition, you can apply it to any incorrect answer choice. You'd be able to figure out why that answer choice is correct. So write this down. An assumption is an unstated idea, which means that you can't infer it from the argument, that must be true for the conclusion to be valid. And this part means that without the assumption, there's a possibility that the conclusion will break apart. Okay. So two things. One is an assumption must provide new information that can't be inferred from the argument. And the second thing is that it must satisfy the must be true test, which means that without this, the conclusion or the argument will break down. In order to get to the assumption, you do need to know the conclusion. Yes. And then that's kind of where I'm going to come next. The important thing is that the correct answer will satisfy both these conditions. Now, statistically, and you see me use stats very rarely when it comes to the verbal aspect of the GMAT, but statistically, 90% of the questions will play on this must be true part over here. But you would get about 10% of the questions that are, fairly tricky, where you'll have incorrect answer choice that will satisfy the must be true condition, but it would not provide any new information. It will have information that you can infer from the argument. Okay, so you need to be aware of both of these. Now, how do you visualize this? So think of this house, which is the argument. Okay, so think of this house as an argument and consider the roof to be the conclusion. Now, you see the three pillars that are keeping the conclusion or the roof upright. Now, these three pillars are premises. These three pillars, once again, are premises, or what we call as a supporting statement. However, out of these three pillars, only one pillar, the pillar in blue, is an essential premise, which means that keeps the roof upright. The other two pillars make the roof stronger, which means they make the conclusion more believable, but they're not essential to keep the roof upright. So those are premises, just premises. The one in blue is that must be true statement, which has to be there for the conclusion to remain true or for the roof to remain upright. So if you were to visualize what an assumption is, think of this the structure and think of the supporting pillars as well as the essential pillar. So in other words, what does must be true mean? It means that if the information provided by assumption is not true, then the conclusion can no longer hold valid, or in other words, the assumption must be true for the conclusion to remain valid. Okay. So what does falsification of conclusion mean, or what does invalidity of conclusion mean? And to do that, we're going to take the same example that we took, which is Joe scored 500 on the GMAT, therefore he will not get admission in an Ivy League college. So under what conditions is the conclusion falsify, or what does falsification or destroying the conclusion means? It means that Joe gets admission into an Ivy League college with a score of 500. Can everyone see that if Joe gets admission with a score of 500, and then the conclusion would be destroyed? Yes. C, okay. We have someone from Mexico, that's good. My neighboring country. Or Spain, for that matter. All right. So now, how do you evaluate whether an answer choice is correct? And I'm gonna use the falsification test over here. And you may find, man, this is something which is intuitive to me. Why are we going about doing this? Why? Because for simple arguments, yes, an intuitive approach works, but as arguments get more complex, you need a much more formal approach. So let's kind of apply that. So again, same argument, okay, and the answer choice that we want to evaluate is that a score of 500 on the GMAT for someone like Joe is unacceptable to Ivy League colleges, and we have to figure out, does this satisfy the must be true condition? Okay, is it must be true, which means if this piece on the left, if this piece over here is no longer true, will Joe get admission in an Ivy League college, or will conclusion break down? To do that, to really say, if this is not true, then by definition, so if a statement is not true, then by definition, its negated instance automatically becomes true. So what is the negated instance of this statement? A score of 500 for someone like Joe is acceptable to Ivy League colleges. If this becomes true, then what happens to the conclusion? Does the conclusion break down? Absolutely. Why? Because if a score of 500 for someone like Joe becomes acceptable, then the author cannot make this claim with 100% certainty that Joe will not get admission into an Ivy League college. The conclusion can break down. Okay, so this is what we call as falsifying the conclusion, or this is what must be true really means. So this tells us that this is the correct answer choice. Now some of you may be confused, and this is essentially what we do when you apply the negation test. Now some of you may be saying, hey, how can you say that if a statement is not true, its negated instance automatically becomes true? How many of you are confused on that part? That if a statement is not true, its negated instance automatically becomes true. Yay, nay. Okay. Okay. Many of you are. Let's kind of look at this. And this is where, if you're an EGMatt student, you actually learn this in the inference module on statements. So let's take a statement over here. Harvard has the best MBA program. Very simple statement. If you're saying that this statement is not true, are you not also saying that Harvard does not have the best MBA program, or an MBA program which is better than or as good as Harvard exists? Are you not saying that automatically if you say this statement is not true, you're also saying that, hey, there's an MBA program which is just as good as Harvard or better than Harvard that exists? So when you say a statement is not true, by definition, what you're saying is its negated version is true. Okay. The second statement is John runs faster than David. If you say that statement is not true, by definition, what you're really saying is that David is as fast or faster than John. Right? Right? They said, hey, John's not faster than David, which means David is just as fast or even faster than John. So when you say a statement is not true, you're saying its negated version is true. That's kind of what you're actually saying. So Shamik says, how do we know which part to be negated in a particular statement? How do I do negation? So again, if you follow the inference module, you can really do that. However, if you need, we've written one of the most comprehensive works on negation. I can share this over here. Here is a statement that you can, an article that you can read on our blog. Okay, how and what to negate. So essentially the principle is, if an answer choice is actually the correct answer choice or the correct assumption, then the conclusion will break down in the presence of the negated version of that answer choice. All right. That's something which is really important. And why do we say that? Because it comes from that definition of assumption. An assumption is an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to be valid. If you have that definition of assumption, you can really infer this from that definition. If an assumption must be true, then without the assumption, the conclusion will break down. All right. Without the assumption means that if you don't have the assumption, you have the negated version of the assumption, which means with the negated version, the conclusion will break down. Let's look at the other part of it, which is really important, which helps you get to the correct answer. If an answer choice is not the correct answer choice, all right, or it's actually the incorrect answer choice, then the conclusion will not break down in the presence of that negated instance of that answer choice. So understanding that aspect is also really important. And this is just the fundamentals of assumption. We've not come to pre-thinking, but we're going to build upon it to do pre-thinking over here. So we're going to cover a lot in this webinar. And from a logic standpoint, this webinar is what I call as a logic heavy webinar. Okay, so let's take an example, same example over here. And the answer choice that we're going to evaluate is this one. A score of 500 on the GMAT is not a good score. This is one of the options that's given to you. You've got to figure out, is this a must be true answer choice? Okay, so you really say, hey, that's a statement I'm going to evaluate. The question that I'm going to ask is exactly the same question. Is it must be true? Which means, will the conclusion break down if the statement on the left no longer holds true? Okay, let's kind of look at this. If the statement to the left no longer holds true, its negated instance becomes true, which means a score of 500 becomes a good score. If we say a score of 500 is not a good score, the negated part is a score of 500 is a good score. If a score of 500 does really become a good score, then in that case, does it mean that the conclusion break down? Or in other words, will Joe get admission into an Ivy League college if a score of 500 is a good score? The answer is no. Why? Because um, the author doesn't make his conclusion based on whether a score of 500 is judged to be a good or a bad score. The author is simply saying, hey, Joe scored 500 on the GMAT, therefore he would not get admission in an Ivy League college. In other words, you can replace the score of 500 with a score of 700. The logic behind the argument would still not change. Okay, so this is the incorrect answer choice, and you can really see in the presence of this negated instance, the conclusion still held true. This is what happens when you put the negation test on an incorrect answer choice. And again, this is not crystal clear to many of you right now, but as we apply this again and again and again, within the next 30 minutes, it's going to be absolutely clear to you guys. Okay, so must be true test helps you narrow down. For the correct answer choice, the conclusion will break down in the presence of negated version. For the incorrect answer choice, the conclusion will continue to hold true when you name in the presence of the negated version. That's kind of the principle of the negation test. And it comes from that very definition of assumption. Keep that definition of assumption close to your heart. Stay with me for another 30 minutes, and this is going to be absolutely clear. So we're going to do a pre-thinking exercise. I'm going to actually put you guys under I'm going to put some stress on you guys for the next 5 to 7 minutes, where I'm going to give you an argument. I'm going to have you think of an assumption. Okay. And again, to do that, make sure you understand the must be true, the core definition of the assumption. So the process that we're going to follow, I'm going to give you an assumption. You're going to put in your pre-thinking. I'm going to give you about 3 minutes. So not 3 minutes, go slow, record your answers in that short answer poll on the right hand side. Then I'm going to look at how do we go about doing pre-thinking. What is a standard approach to doing pre-thinking? And then from there on, we're going to evaluate a couple of submissions to see why they are correct or incorrect. Okay. So with that, certain things that, if you want to do this correct, certain things that you should know. The first thing is you need to be able to read an argument. Okay. You need to be able to understand what the conclusion is, and then if you're reading properly, you should be able to understand the logic that the author uses to arrive at the conclusion. You already know what an assumption is. Now, why is it that some of you will falter? Because you're used to reading quickly. You don't have that habit of reading slowly. If you want to ace the GMAT, slow down. Because when you slow down, you actually answer questions more quickly. And some of you will just keep on looking at the clock and not ask the right question, but you'd say, hey man, what is the assumption? Hey man, what is the assumption? Rather than really say, hey, what is the logic that the author is using? So let's kind of go about doing this. Get a pen and paper ready. And I'm going to share the first argument with you. 3, 2, and 1. Here is your first argument. Clear this poll, remove broadcast results, and you can put your response. And in case you guys are wondering what you have to do, you have to really answer the question, what does the author assume here? All right, let's get those answers in last 15 seconds. I have close to 50 responses. 3, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll. I'm going to broadcast the results so that you guys can really see the responses overall. Good responses, by the way. And when I say good responses, I can really see you guys tried really hard. Some of you have put in generic stuff which says, hey, there's no other factor overall. Some of you have talked about in the reward systems influence a teacher's teaching skills. That's something which you put in. I think two things which is this. One is you guys put in the effort. Those of you put in the responses, put in the effort. The second is that despite putting in the effort, you weren't able to precisely get to essentially the core of the argument. So let's kind of go about doing this. And one of the most important things when it comes to understanding an assumption is to understand the conclusion. And to do that, I'm going to divide this entire argument into 3 different statements. And I want you to tell me which statement is the main conclusion. Now, the poll that I have over here has 4 statements over here. So essentially, actually, let's talk about the process. So the way we're going to go about finding the assumption is we're going to understand the conclusion. We're going to look at how the author arrives at the conclusion. We're going to draw the logical structure of the argument, and then we're going to ask a pre-thinking question. And what's the question that we're going to ask? Let's kind of take a look at that. Okay. Now, when you think about an assumption is an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to be valid. So this means an assumption is a savior of the conclusion. Without the assumption, the conclusion will break down. So to figure out where to put the conclusion or where to put the assumption, remember that assumption was that essential pillar in that diagram, we have to figure out scenarios where the conclusion breaks down. Why? Because if we figure out where the conclusion breaks down, we can put an assumption over there to prevent the conclusion from breaking down. So to find assumptions, let's kind of figure out which scenarios break the conclusion down. The assumption simply is that those scenarios cannot exist. So let's kind of see this in practice. So the question that we have to ask is, under what circumstances, given the facts in the argument, will the conclusion break down? The answer to this question will help us come up with assumptions. So here is your argument. Tell me which statement is the conclusion. And again, remember, only use choices 1 to 3, not choice 4. So there's no statement 4 over here. So statement 1, 2, or 3. Which statement is the main conclusion of the argument? Let's get a few more responses. Which statement is the main conclusion? Three, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll. And it's really important that you put in a response. Why? Because even when you make a mistake, you get feedback that's personalized to you. If you don't put in a response, you don't put a stake in the ground, you don't get feedback. All right, 43% of you rarely say statement 2 is the main conclusion, and you guys are absolutely correct. This statement is the main conclusion. But 27% of you say that statement 1 is the main conclusion. 29% of you say statement 3 is the main conclusion, and those of you, more than half the class is wrong over here. So why do we say that statement 2 is the main conclusion? In an argument, the main conclusion is always by the author. Okay, when you look at statement 1 says a recently published paper concludes. So statement 1 is not by the author. It actually is this conclusion is not by the author. When you see the word concludes over here, it's not what the author is saying, it's what the paper is saying. Statement 1 is actually a fact, and who said that? JB said that. Thank you very much, JB. The second statement is what the author is trying to assert. He says clearly the difference between professors in the tenure system and other full-time lecturers has to do with the reward system for the former. This is what the author wants you to believe. And then statement 3 is essentially a supporting statement which is written to support statement 2. He says the criterion for rewarding excuse me, tenured faculty places greater emphasis on research than on teaching. So this is also a fact which is written to support the main conclusion, and statement 1 is the context. Okay, so remember this. What is the main conclusion? It's what the author wants you as a reader to believe. And what does the author want you to believe? That the difference, what the author is saying is, hey, I'm not disputing the data presented by this paper. What I'm really saying is the reason why that difference exists is because of the reward system. Okay, it's because the reward system for full-time lecturers. Oh, sorry, for professors in the tenure system. Because of the reward system for professors in the tenure system, that is why the difference exists. Okay, is that clear to everyone? Especially those who chose statement 1 or statement 3 to be the main conclusion. Is that clear? I'd appreciate a yay or a nay. Perfect, thank you. So we're going to ask the pre-thinking question over here, which is, under what circumstances would the reward system not be responsible for the difference in performance, given that full-time lecturers enhance student learning more than professors do, and given that reward systems for professors, that reward system places a greater emphasis on research than on teaching. The question that you have to really say is, under what circumstances would the reward system not be responsible? Okay, so what are some of the possible scenarios in which you can't blame the reward system? All right, one is if non-tenured faculty has a similar emphasis has a similar reward system, which means the reward system for both the entities, which is tenured and non-tenured, is identical. In that case, you cannot blame the reward system. Is that clear to everyone? If non-tenured faculty has the exact same reward system, then you can't blame reward system. The difference still exists, but the cause has to be something different. Right? Now, what is another way of this? If you can say, yes, there is this reward system, but most tenured faculty doesn't act as per the reward system, they don't care about the reward system, okay, then in that case also you can't blame the reward system. Is the second falsifying condition also clear? Okay, in either of these scenarios the reward system can't be blamed, and both of these scenarios are falsifying conditions. Now some of you may say, hey, but I said there's no other reason which is there. Yes, that's a generic way of coming up with the argument, and for every causal argument you can come up with that generic answer. However, that's not how the test is going to word it. Okay. So what are the assumptions? If these are the scenarios in which the conclusion breaks down, then the assumptions which are there is that these scenarios are not possible, which means non-tenured faculty do not have the same reward system, and most tenured faculty does care about the reward system. Can you really see the transition from the falsifying scenarios to actually coming up with the real assumptions? This one and this one. Let's see a few more yeses or nos. Okay, a good chunk of you were able to figure this out. If this is a falsifying condition that, hey, if non-tenured faculty has similar emphasis on research, which means the reward system is identical to that of tenured, then and if this breaks my conclusion down, then the assumption really is, because remember, an assumption prevents the conclusion from breaking down, that non-tenured faculty do not have an identical reward system. Okay. And then the second piece which is there is, if most tenured professors do not act as per the reward system, if that breaks the conclusion down, then what you have to really say is the assumption is that most tenured professors have to care about the reward system. All right, those are my assumptions overall. So some of you are saying, hey, how does this help me address the efficiency of teaching? Does the author care about addressing the efficiency of teaching? Does the author care about? No, in the conclusion, the author doesn't care about the efficiency of teaching. The author wants to figure out what is causing the inefficiency. And that's a very important distinction. The conclusion is the reason why tenured faculty is not as effective as non-tenured faculty is because of the reward system. Okay, he's not worried about how to fix that. And that's really important, Shamik. What if you think possible scenario that experience plays an important role in teaching? No. Whereas, is there experience anywhere in the argument? Let me just bring the argument. Yes, I'm going to show the argument again. Let's bring in my notes pane, tenured professors. Where is experience over here? These are the three sentences. I'm going to remove this part. This was not a part of the argument. See Thalak Swami. Do you see the word experience in the argument? No, there is no experience in the argument. Again, this is something that you know from your experience that, hey, if you're a tenured faculty, you probably have more experience, but that's not what's there in the argument. Next says, could there be other falsifying scenarios like bright students are taught by full-time lecturer by full-time faculty, and hence those students perform well? Now, next, is the argument talking about end performance of students? Is the argument talking about end performance of students? No, it's talking about enhancing student learning. And this is a really important distinction that I want to make sure you have. A lot of people, and I think some of you actually have this question, which is, a lot of people ask, hey Rajat, what percentage of your students score a 700? And my answer to that is I can give you the percentage, but that's not the metric that I track. The metric that I track is the score improvement that we impart. And an average EGMatter gets about between 70 to 80 points of score improvement. An average EGMatter has a score of about 120 points of score improvement. So we hit that 80 point, and that's a metric that we measure over the years. And I use the word average because some people will tell you that a few of their students get 80 points. No, this is the average EGMatter that gets 80 point of score improvement. Okay, and that's enhancing student learning. All right. We have people, and you're going to see some examples later on this webinar, who've scored 770, but they've gotten 50 points of score improvement. Why? Because they started the e-GMAT course when they were at a 720. They're below average, but hey, their student learning was enhanced to their satisfaction. Okay, and that's kind of where it's really important. No. That's a really great question. Who asked this question? Arjun asked a really great question. He says, isn't the conclusion already saying there's a difference in the reward system between the two? No, the conclusion isn't saying that, Arjun, but it's a really great question. He says, clearly the difference has to do with the reward system for the former. Okay, in the conclusion, whose reward system is he talking about? In the conclusion, who's former here? Who's former here? Tenured faculty, right? And then in this over here, the criterion for rewarding tenured faculty typically places a greater emphasis. This word greater, what does it compare? Greater is a comparative word. What does it compare? No, reward for whom? Reward system for whom? For tenured faculty. So what it's really saying, if you look at statement 3 over here, and this is statement 3. If you look at statement 3 over here, what the statement 3 is saying is that there's a greater emphasis on research than on teaching. So maybe research has 70% emphasis, and teaching has 30% emphasis. That's what this statement is saying. Now, does statement 3 tell you anything about non-tenured faculty? No, it doesn't. It is only telling you about tenured faculty over here. Okay? And that's what the assumption is, yes. And that's really, really important. For those of you who say yes, kind of, no, you're not reading statement 3 correctly. Prakhar. It only tells you about tenured faculty. The criterion for rewarding tenured faculty typically places a greater emphasis on research than on teaching. It only tells you about tenured faculty over here. Okay, and that's, if you're facing issues reading these statements, this means that you need to understand how do you infer from statements. That's really important. You need to go through our master comprehension course. And you need to go through the inference module, which is kind of why it's there before the assumptions module. Okay. So, but the thing which is there that I want you to really see is when you ask that falsification question, you can come up with falsification scenarios, and when you come up with falsification scenarios, you can really come up with assumptions really beautifully. Now, to emphasize on this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to up the ante over here. I'm going to give you a full-length question, an official full-length question, and I'm going to leave this with the PDFs. I'm not going to discuss this. We already have shared the negation article, but I'm going to give you an official question, and if you follow this method in the official question, you're going to find getting to the correct answer becomes much easier than it is otherwise. If you don't follow this method, you're going to be confused with the answer choices that are there. So, but how would you guys feel? And that's something that I want to make sure that you do this. Now, how many of you over here, let me just put a yay nay essentially. How many of you here are concerned about timing? How many of you are concerned, yay and nay, and say, man, this seems to take very long? 91% of you are concerned about timing. And again, when you look at this method, you'd be right to be concerned about timing. But I will tell you this, and some of you talked about stats, we wouldn't be GMAT Club's most successful company if this method didn't work. And when I say GMAT Club's most successful company, if you go on GMAT Club, share GMAT experience, and click the tag EGMatt, you're going to find 10 pages of success story. If you click on any other company, the most you're going to find is 4 to 5 pages. Each page has about 50 success stories. If you look at the review section, very similar stuff. So this works, and if you trust it, if you Google Prethinking and around those success stories, you're going to really see a lot of people who became successful felt the same way as you do today. So this is how you're going to feel throughout this entire journey. Let's say you're this guy who's starting at that medium time to answer questions, and your accuracy is low. And this is a relative term. I have 150 students here. Each one of you is going to be different. Okay. Now, once you start answering pre-thinking, two things will happen. One is your accuracy will automatically go up. The second is your time to answer questions will also go up. And if you're like most students, you're going to really worry about it. Why? Because you're going to really say, man, I already worry about timing on the verbal section of the GMAT. This is taking my time to answer questions even further up. At that point, I want you to trust me. I want you to continue doing pre-thinking. And as you continue doing that, a pivotal moment will come where your understanding of the argument will start to improve to a degree where your time to answer questions is going to go way lower than what you started with, but your accuracy is going to be way higher. At that point, you're going to say, now I understand why we use pre-thinking. And then as you continue to do that, you're going to actually continue to reduce your time to answer questions and continue to improve on your ability. And that's when you'd really realize that power of pre-thinking. This is what I call as a level 1, level 2, or a level 3 pre-thinker. And again, here is some data. I talked about those 10 pages of success stories. Actually, now it's probably more. This was the data that I looked at in December. So there's a statement where someone says, understand the passage completely, take your time, equally important, pre-think, and answer before looking at the answer choice. Probably this one word will have the most impact on your GMAT score. This guy scored 740. There's another guy who improved from 700 to 770. And this guy, when he scored 700, had 35th percentile in critical reasoning. The nice thing is you can actually see his ESR, and you can see that improvement. He improved. Once he started following pre-thinking, he improved from a 35th percentile to a 97th percentile in pre-thinking, in critical reasoning in about 20 days. What he says is, when it gets to 700 plus level questions, you have to do pre-thinking. The reason to do pre-thinking is to help you focus on the logic and not deviate from the key argument when trap or out of scope answer choices show up. This guy is a Canadian, a Chinese Canadian, and again, actually he was born in Canada, so I would call him a Canadian. As another guy who really says, he says, this pre-thinking primes your mind and we're constantly on our toes while reading an RC paragraph. Yes, pre-thinking is really useful in RC paragraph or a CR question stem. Apart from comprehending the passage, we keep speculating that in which direction the passage will orient or what logical jump has the author taken. Okay, here's a guy who improved by about 220 points or so. So again, power through it. There's a reason why a 740 is a 96, 97 percentile, a 760 is 99 percentile, because they're pretty much everyone has access to very similar resources. People who power through things actually get to those ability scores or get to those high GMAT scores. So before I go into example two, there's a question which says, since there are multiple assumptions, what if pre-thinking doesn't align with that of any of the answer choices? Prakhar, as I said early on in this webinar, that the purpose of pre-thinking, and as you actually read what Alvok also said, is the goal of pre-thinking is to understand the logic. Once you understand the logic, even if you see an answer choice which you did not pre-think about, but if that answer choice is there in the list of answer choices, you'd be able to easily identify that answer choice. Is pre-thinking applicable only to assumption questions? No, it's applicable to every argument-based question, whether it's assumption, evaluate, strengthen, weaken, or boldface. Okay, so with that, example two, let's get going. And I'm going to give you the answer choices for this one. Again, remember the definition of assumption, do pre-thinking. Otherwise, you're going to find that answer choices are fairly confusing. All right, last 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll and broadcast the results. So, two choices really popular. Choice E, really popular, 34% of you chose it. Choice B, really popular, about 37% of you chose choice B. the other choices, choice A was popular as well, so was choice C as well as choice D. So this is an official question. It's not an EGMatt question. And again, if you don't understand the definition of assumption, if you don't do pre-thinking, this is designed to confuse you. So let's kind of go about doing this. And let's get my poll question. Which statement is the main conclusion? Or what is the main conclusion? Let me get in my short answer pod here. Which statement is the main conclusion? Or rather, what is the main conclusion? It's 2, but what is the main conclusion? The annual revenue will increase by about 50%. Okay, the revenue will go by at least 50%. Okay. Now, let's kind of go over here. Here is the argument. How do we estimate annual revenue? In very simple terms. How do we estimate annual revenue? Now, what's the mathematical way of estimating annual revenue? Revenue is not income minus expenditure. No, that's profit. Okay, total distance for the year divided by mile per price per mile charge. Total miles and times USD per mile. That's really good. So annual revenue is toll per mile multiplied by the total number of toll miles that are done. Is that clear to everyone? Is that clear to everyone? Okay, those of you who are saying no, why is that not clear? Belinda or Eleonora, why is that not clear? Total revenue that they generate is essentially how much they charge for every mile and how many miles are traveled on the highways. Okay, that's very simple. Now, let's do our pre-thinking. In the pre-thinking, the question that we ask is, under what circumstances, given the facts in the argument, will the conclusion break down? Okay. Now, what are the facts in the argument? Or in other words, if we really fill in the blanks, under what circumstances would the annual revenue not increase by 50%, provided that we know that the toll per mile, which is this term, is already going to be increased by 50%. So under what circumstances would the annual revenue not increase by 50%? When the total distance traveled decreases. Yes, when the total number of miles decrease. The only falsifying scenario is if the total number of miles decreases. That number decreases, then the annual revenue will not go up, which means the assumption is that the total number of miles driven does not decrease. Okay. Some of you were really talking about what about people, what about trips and all of that. We're going to talk about it, but you don't know the answer choices. Remember, pre-thinking is done before you start looking at the answer choices. Okay. You just know this. This is your assumption. Is that clear? This is fairly simple math. Okay, which part? Next says, shouldn't the total revenue be toll per mile into total number of miles into number of vehicles? No. Is there a per vehicle tax as per the information in the argument, Next, is there a per vehicle tax that we employ or that's being charged? No. So then why do you put vehicles in there? It's about the total number of miles. The revenue would remain the same if 1,000 vehicles traveled 1,000,000 miles or if one vehicle traveled 1,000,000 miles. Right? It's about the total number of miles traveled. Okay. Now, before I go and look at the answer choices, what is the definition of an assumption? What is the definition of an assumption? It's an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to hold true. Remember this. The assumption is, and I said, that's if you understand this, you're going to be able to answer every question. An assumption is an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to hold true. Now, keep that definition in mind as we go through the answer choices. Okay. Now, in this set of answer choices, which answer choice talks about the total difference? Total distance, I'm sorry. Which answer choice talks about the total distance? Choice E. That is my correct answer. But what about choices B, C, and D? And we're going to really talk about them now. Let's look at choice B. Choice B says the total number of trips made on the toll highway per year will not decrease from its current level. Okay, which means that if you were making 1,000 trips before that, okay, now you're going to continue to make 1,000 trips. All right. So the question that you're going to ask is, if the total number of trips goes down, if that number goes down, does this mean that the total number of miles traveled will go down? Does it definitely mean that the total number of miles traveled would go down? No, not really. Why? Because, hey, even if there are fewer trips, if the total number of miles per trip increases, if the length of trip increases, then you could still travel this thing. You can still travel this. So is this a must be true? Is this required to be true for the conclusion to hold true? Is this a must be true? No, it's not. This is what I call as a really good strengthener, but not an assumption. Okay. This will increase your belief in the conclusion, but this is not a must be true. If you remember that picture of the house and there were those pillars on the sides, these are those pillars on the sides. This is not that blue pillar that we talked about. Okay, and the EGMatt will throw such answer choices at you. Now, if you look at a few other answer choices, let's look at this, the average length of the trip. Okay, we're going to go talk about this. Is it important that the average length of the trip remain the same? Is that a must be true? What happens if the average length of the trip goes down? You can have more trips to keep the total number of miles the same. Right? That's also a good strengthener, but not a must be true. Shamik says, and Shamik, this is where I think, yes, you have to assume that this highway under discussion has multiple exits and thus the trips per mile will vary with vehicles, right? Yes, I think that's kind of a normal thing, I would say, yes. You have a toll per mile, remember this, you don't have a toll per trip. And choice D, so I can explain choice C once again. Choice C talks about the average length of the trip. So if the average length of the trip, if in the past, and let's kind of take a pod over here very quickly, if in the past, so prior to this, just increase this, if I had 1,000 trips and the average length of the trip was 50 miles, what the author is saying as in choice C is that the length of trip has to remain same, which means the length of trip cannot be 25 miles. But that's not true. A length of the trip can go down to 25 miles because we can have more trips. Instead of 1,000, we can now have 2,000 trips. So the length of trip is not a must be true. Okay. Vinati says the problem was I was confused in two answer choices. Here it was E and B. Where am I going wrong? Can you advise? Vinati, you're not following the process. You're not asking the pre-thinking question. There is no way in the world that choice C could be correct, even if choice E weren't present. Okay, and for those of you who consider choice C, there are two kinds of people that exist in this world. One is who really say, man, I was able to narrow it down to 2 out of 5 answer choices. Let me give a pat on my back. Those people don't go beyond 650. But there are other people who really get this wrong and really say, why the hell did I make that mistake? Is choice C or choice B even a close answer choice? And the answer to that is no. They are not. When it comes to the context of assumption, they are not correct answer choices. They are not the next best answer choice. Again, on the GMAT, the concept of next best does not exist. Wherever you've been reading to really say, hey, we have to always find the best answer choice. No, people who are telling you they don't do research on the GMAT, they don't create questions, they don't analyze questions. If you look at EGMatt, look at our company history, look at the company. Everyone who works at EGMatt works full time. We spend 80% of our time doing R&D. When you look at other companies, what you're going to find is they have hundreds of instructors who spend only 6 hours a week teaching the GMAT, not doing R&D. Okay, there's only one correct answer on the out of the 5 answer choices. Every other answer choice is incorrect. Okay, so choices B and C. Don't pat yourself on the back saying, hey, I got it, I rejected a few answer choices, I was just between two. You choose the wrong answer, you get the same penalty, regardless of whether it narrowed it down to 2 or whether you weren't able to narrow it down. And by the way, if you chose choice B or C, you make as big a mistake as someone who chose choice A. Because the concept clarity is not there. On the other hand, if you made a mistake, understand the causality, understand why you made a mistake. Once you understand why you made a mistake, then you can tell yourself what is it that you're going to do to avoid that mistake. If you address that causality, you address the mistake, you don't repeat the mistake, you score higher. Do we have a webinar in CR to show how to review CR questions? There is, yes. Write to me and I'd be happy to send a recording to that webinar. In fact, if you are an EGMatt student, we call this what we call as a strategic review. Okay, and again, the amount of detail that we provide in every question that we have on the platform is the same detail that we went through right now. Okay, so we're going to now do 2 full-length questions. And these are again official questions. These are probably the most challenging questions that you're going to see on the test. Many of you will get them wrong, but once we go through the pre-thinking approach, you're going to find it so simple to get these right. Okay, so since these are difficult questions, I do not want to time you. I want you to select not answered. So there is this option of not answered, and then when 80% of you choose an option other than not answered, I would call time. That way you as a group would time yourself. All right, let's get at least 70 people to select not answered. Let's get at least 70 people to select not answered. That way I will then show the question stem. I have 49, 53, 54, 59, 60. 60 is actually good enough. I have a representative enough group. Here is your first question. Good luck. All right, guys, 80% of you are done. Get those answers in. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll and let me broadcast the results. So this is what I call the split theory. The most popular choice, 30%, 31% of you chose that, but then we have choices A, B, and C, which are also quite popular. Right, let me hide this poll. We're going to go to the next question, but before that, I want you to select not answered so that I can really time you guys accordingly. All right, let's get to 60 people saying not answered. 3, 2, and 1. I'm closer to 60. Let me remove broadcast results. Here is your next question. You should be seeing the next question now. Good luck. All right, guys, 80% of the class is done. Let's get those answers in. 3, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll and broadcast the results. Again, in this choice D, very popular. The most popular choice, I think choice D has been the most popular one in both the questions. Choices E and C are quite popular as well overall. So that's really good to know. Okay, difficult questions. So if you make a mistake, don't worry. The idea is for you to learn from these questions. Okay. So RDS technology, official question, fairly old question, but I think it's beautifully, both these questions are beautifully crafted, and that's why they are there. Why? Because when you make a mistake, it just tells you where you made a mistake, and it tells you when you're doing the question, when you're attempting the question, where are you faltering. So the main conclusion is that the number of Overlanders receiving special program information probably did not increase significantly during this time period. Now, I want you to read this statement once again and read it slowly. And again, remember I said if you make a mistake, it's because you're not reading the statement slowly enough. Now, when you read this slowly, there'll be a few pieces of information that you'd be able to extract. One is it's about Overlanders. It's not about people from outside, A. The second is that the conclusion's only concerned about special programs. And the third is the conclusion is concerned about what happened during this time period, not before this time period and not after this time period, but during this time period. Can you guys see all three aspects of this conclusion? Can you guys see that? Yes. The reason why this is important is because any answer choice that doesn't talk about these aspects, or it doesn't impact these aspects, is probably not the correct answer. Okay. And what I'm going to prove to you when we do this is the most popular answer choice in this question doesn't talk about these aspects. Okay. So the conclusion is saying the number of Overlanders receiving special program information probably did not increase significantly. Essentially, what it's saying is, if 1,000 people, received special program information in 94, another 1,000, a similar number, or about 1,000 received the same in 96. And then, why does the author say that? He says there are two things that are kind of impacting this thing. One positively, the other one negatively. One is the number of RDS equipped radios in 94 and 96 remain the same. So this is what I call as your supporting statement. Why? Because if there were 1,000 radios or 600 radios in 94, there are 600 radios in 96. But the number of transmitting stations between 94 and 96 more than double. So this is essentially a contradictory statement. Now this kind of goes against the conclusion. Why? Because you can really see both these statements are linked by this word. However, also if you understand the logic, you can really say if there are more transmitting stations, probably more people receiving this. But again, the conclusion says otherwise. Okay, and then statement one, really important statement, sets the context, and what it really says is that radio stations with this special technology, RDS technology, broadcast special program information that only radios with RDS feature can receive. So essentially, what it's saying is, to receive a special program information, you need the transmitting station to have this technology, and you need the receiving radio to have this technology. Both things need to happen. The transmitting tower should have this RDS technology. The receiving radio should also have this technology. Okay. So let's kind of draw the logical structure of this argument. The conclusion is between 94 and 96. Then the number of Overlanders receiving RDS information, that didn't change a whole lot. Between these 2 years, two things happened. The number of radios remained almost unchanged. The number of stations increased quite a bit. The context is, to receive RDS programming, you need RDS radios. And again, based on this is your conclusion. Okay. How does the word transitioning again? Please put the question in the Q&A pod. I'll look at the short answer pod for your responses, Vinati. How does the word however impact here? The word however tells you it's what I call as a leading indicator overall, or a keyword which really says that statement 2 and statement 3 go against one another, and since statement 3 supports the conclusion, you can really infer that statement 2 would probably be going against the conclusion. Even if you don't see the word however, if you understood the content of these statements, you'd kind of come to the same conclusion. Does that help, Vinati? Okay, so what's my falsification question? My falsification question is, Under what circumstances or under what conditions will there be a significant addition? Remember, the conclusion says there'll be very few additional Verlanders. So I'm going to falsify this by saying there'll be a significant addition to the number of people receiving RDS programming, given that there are very few additional radios and given that there are a lot more transmitting stations. So under what conditions can I falsify the conclusion? Can you tell me? Under what conditions will there be way more people receiving RDS programming? If the number of receiving radios remain the same and the number of radios remain the same, okay, whether they gather in groups to listen. If I start to put these radios in Starbucks, that's very important. Then that's one condition. That's very good. I agree with that. And then number of people per radio, that's one condition. Then what else? If other radios during this time achieve the ability to do this, no, you can't. You can't go against the facts and the argument. The facts say the number of RDS radios remain the same. So people with RDS radios move into the transmitting areas, yes, or the transmitting areas expand. So more people reach. More radios with the RDS technology are in range now. All right, so there are two ways in which the conclusion can be falsified. If the additional stations, the new stations, remember this part over here, the number of RDS stations increased a lot, now cover areas where people had the right kind of radio, but there was no coverage earlier, so there's increase in coverage. And the second condition is if way more people are listening to every RDS radio, if you start putting these radios in Starbucks. Are the falsification scenarios clear? Under both these scenarios, the conclusion would be shattered, right? And you guys are able to come up with these scenarios by yourself, by the way. Many of you were able to do that. Now, if that is the case, then the assumption which is there is that the new stations don't increase coverage and people per radio remain about the same. Both of these are equally good assumptions. Okay. Can you see the transition from falsification conditions to assumptions? Okay, let's get a few more yeses or nos. All right, read them and see. This one leads to this. These are falsification conditions and this one leads to this. Assumption 2 is people per radio remain the same. If you had 1,000 radios before, now you have you have the same 1,000 radios, but now earlier on the 1,000 radios were in homes, so only a few people listen to them. Now you put half of these radios in Starbucks, so the people per radio suddenly go up from 2 per radio to 20 per radio. Then despite the same number of radios, you'll have more people receiving special program information. Okay, assumption, that's your assumption 2. Devajot, does that help you? Devajot? All right, perfect. Okay, let's kind of look at, please explain assumption 1. Assumption 1 is, hey, you had 1,000 radios, but only 30% of them actually were within the listening area of an RDS tower. So you have 1,000 radios, but only 300 of them were connected to a transmitting station in which had RDS programming. Now, because you added more transmitting station, so instead of 300, now 600 of them are connected to a transmitting tower. Okay, so if that happens, your conclusion breaks down. So Anish, does that help? Perfect. Okay. Drew says, why would anyone buy an RDS radio when they knew they wouldn't have any coverage? It's not any coverage, it's RDS coverage. Have you heard of AM and FM transmitters or AM and FM radios? Yes. Or have you heard of an iPhone which has? Do you own a current iPhone that was bought last year? How many of you own a current iPhone that was bought last year? Why would you buy an iPhone with 4G technology when you know 5G is coming? That's the same logic. 4G is still very useful, right? That's the same way. Without special programming information, the radios are still useful. Okay. So it's not that they were useless. It's just that the conclusion is about that special programming. So good question. I mean, I like these questions. It tells you where your mind's going, and it also tells you when you're reading, what are you missing? Okay. So choice A, I'm going to really show the poll responses here. I'm going to remove that generic short answer part so that we can bring in the poll responses. Here is RDS Technologies. Here are the answer choices. Choice A, 21% of you chose choice A. Choice A is the correct answer. It's a very wordy answer choice, so I'm going to really simplify it. Choice A says, few if any of RDS radio stations that began broadcasting after 94 broadcast to people with RDS equipped radios living in areas not previously reached by RDS stations. Super wordy answer choice. Let's simplify this. What this choice is really saying is few if any means almost none of the RDS radio stations that began broadcasting after 94. Which are the RDS radio stations that began broadcasting after 94? These are the new radio stations that were added. Broadcast to people with RDS equipped radios living in areas not previously leased. So if the new stations are broadcasting to the people who had the right kind of radio but were not reached, what it's really saying is increasing the coverage of RDS programming. That's exactly the definition of increasing the coverage of RDS programming. So what this answer choice is saying is that almost none of the new stations increase the coverage of RDS programming. It is in line with the Prethinking 1, which is what was there. And if you want to really evaluate it, you really say, hey, what's the negation of this? Negated statement is at least some radio stations increase the coverage of RDS programming. If at least some radio stations increase the coverage of RDS programming, then what happens to my conclusion? The conclusion breaks down. Why? Because if there are new people who had the right kind of radio but could not receive programming and they can now receive programming, then the author cannot really say with 100% certainty that, hey, the coverage, so the number of people receiving RDS programming in 96 is same as was the case in 1994. Sophisticated answer choice, complex answer choice, but hopefully this tells most of you get it, why this was the correct answer. And you can really see how we went from pre-thinking to this, it got to this. Okay. All right. Do you guys get it? Yay, nay? Verbal is like math. It's about logic. Math is logic. I mean, even GMAT math, if you attend the webinar tomorrow, you're going to figure out it's logic. It's not math. Okay. This is the correct answer. Okay. So let's look at choice B. We're going to look at every answer choice. Why was choice C not an answer? Why is choice B not an answer? We're going to look at that as well. So don't worry about it. First, focus on understanding. Let's look at choice B and then we're going to look at choice C. Choice B really says, in 1996, most Worldlanders who lived within the listening area of an RDS station already had a radio equipped to receive RDS. Now, let me just go back to and I'm going to sound like a broken record, I would, and then you're going to see this happen again and again. What is the definition of an assumption? What is the definition of an assumption? It's an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to remain valid, right? Must be true, unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to remain valid. So let's see what this answer choice is saying. But before that, what's the conclusion? The conclusion is the number of Worldlanders who received special program information did not change between 94 and 96. So let's now see what this answer choice is saying. It's saying that most Worldlanders, in 1996, most Worldlanders who live within the listening area had a radio equipped to receive RDS. So essentially what it's saying is that in 1996, most is more than 50%. Let's just take an example. 70% of the Worldlanders had a radio equipped to receive RDS programming. Now my question to you is, if for the conclusion to be true, which is that, hey, the number of Worldlanders receiving special programming between 94 and 96 did not change a whole lot, is it required that most Worldlanders have this right kind of radio? Is it required? Or in other words, what if 20% of Worldlanders had an RDS radio in 94 and the same 20% had an RDS radio in 96? Will the conclusion still not continue to hold true? Is it required that the word most be there? Yay, nay? Yes, no? No. It's not required that the word that most Worldlanders in 96 have that. Again, that's where having that precise understanding of conclusion is really important. Okay, let's look at choice C. Now, what kind of programming is the conclusion concerned about? What kind of programming is the conclusion concerned about? Special programming, or what we call as RDS programming. It's the same thing, right? Now, if a radio station does not have RDS technology, can it transmit special programming? No. Can it transmit special programming? No. Or a special program information? No, it cannot. Okay. So what is the range of special program information for a radio station that doesn't have RDS technology in pure mathematical forms? What is the range of special program information for a radio station? 0. Yes, absolutely. Okay, it's 0. It can't even transmit. Okay. So when you talk about decreasing the station's listening area, what kind of programming is this answer choice talking about? By inference, what kind of programming are we talking about? Is it special programming or non-special programming? Is it special or non-special? No, it's non-special. Because if a radio station doesn't have RDS technology, it can only broadcast non-special programming. And do we care about the decrease in range of non-special programming? Do we care about that? No. Because answer choice has nothing to do with my conclusion. What did you learn from this? Why did you guys choose this answer choice, those of you who did choose this answer choice? You didn't think about it enough. You didn't think, how does this information fit in the context of what's given to me in the argument? Let's look at choice D. Choice D was really popular and it's incorrect. Read this again. In 1996, Worldlanders who did not own radios equipped to receive RDS. Do we care about people who don't have the right kind of radio? Do we care about them in my conclusion? No. Could not receive any programming. Do I care about any programming? No, I only care about special programming. So this is wrong on 2 counts. In fact, had you just read the conclusion, had you just understood the conclusion, you could have rejected this answer choice without reading the rest of the argument. Okay, the type of programming again doesn't matter. So What did you learn from this? It's a difficult question, not an easy question, probably the most difficult question in assumption. But if you visualize the question, if you ask the right falsification question, if you visualize the argument, if you ask the right falsification question, man, you're going to get to the answer easily. But if you can't visualize it, if you can't get asked the right if you can't formulate the falsification question, you're going to have difficulties getting to that 95th percentile in critical reasoning. But even in this difficult question, every other answer choice was completely wrong. There was no close answer choice here. If you understand the logic, you're going to figure out that the correct answer choice is absolutely correct. The incorrect answer choice is absolutely wrong. Okay. Can you see that? The correct answer choice, absolutely correct. Incorrect answer choice, absolutely wrong. Okay, a few more yeses. I know it's getting taxing, but a few more yeses would be helpful. All right, let's go to the last question for the day. We're going to discuss this briefly. Shelby will refuse. Here is how you guys did. Choice D was very popular. Choice D for delta is the correct answer, but choices C and E are also very popular. The previous question, choice A was the correct answer. In this question, choice D is the correct answer. But let's see if you got to choice D for the correct reasons. So what was going on? Last year, what we did was we collected a bunch of garbage. And actually, I need the short answer part over here. We collected a bunch of garbage. We did not send anything for recycling. We sent everything for incineration or burning. And this incineration generated a lot of ash. So since I could get it was easy for me to get an icon for a trash can. Let's assume one trash can is one truck or one truckload of refuse. So how many truckloads did I send last year? How many truckloads did I send last year? 10, right? Now, as per the information in the argument, if I collect the same amount of refuse this year, how many truckloads am I going to send this year? If I collect the same amount of refuse, I'm going to send 5 truckloads this year for incineration, right? Now, here is my question, and understand this question very carefully. If I collect, instead of collecting the same amount of refuse, if I collect 10 times as much refuse, if I collect 10x as much refuse, then how many truckloads will I be sending this year? If I collect 10x as much refuse. Let's get your responses. The question is, if I collect 10 times as much refuse, how many truckloads will I be sending for incineration this year? And again, I have quite a few people in this webinar. I want to make sure I get more and more answers. Three, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll. I'm going to broadcast the results. Half of you said 50 truckloads. Some of you said 100 truckloads. Only 23% of you said 5 truckloads. Those of you who said 5 truckloads are correct. Only 10 of you absolutely understood the argument and got the correct answer. The others, didn't understand the logic of the argument. But still, many of you were able to get to the correct answer, and which means that if you have another instance of this question, there's a chance you might not. So let's kind of understand why this is there. So let's kind of look at the last statement. This year, city services will separate for recycling enough refuse. Two is a purpose word, which means with an outcome in mind. to reduce the number of truckloads of refuse to be incinerated to half of last year's number. So what this statement is saying is, regardless of the amount of refuse that I collect this year, I'm only going to send as many truckloads for incineration, which is half of what it was last year. So if last year I sent 10 truckloads of refuse for incineration, even if I collect 100 truckloads worth of refuse this year, I'm only going to send half as many truckloads for incineration. Read the statement once again. Is that clear? The comparison is to half of last year's number. So even if you collect 100 truckloads, right, this year, so even if the amount of refuse collected is 10 times higher, I'm only going to send half as many truckloads. Read it again. It's a beautifully worded argument. And this is the beauty of it. Just look at, that's the beauty of language. And people worship poetry. I worship stuff such as this. Okay, if I'm only going to get half as many truckloads, if I'm only going to get half as many truckloads for incineration, then what's the only thing that is required to be true for the conclusion to hold true? What is the only thing that is required to be true? The material per truckload or the ash generated per truckload, as Shamik is saying, should be similar. Ash generated per truckload, it should be similar or less than what it was last year. That's the only thing. If each truckload generates way more ash, then you're still going to have a problem. Okay. For those of you who are saying recycling, whatever is recycled is not incinerated. That's something which is given. I mean, when you recycle someone, you're not burning it. Otherwise, it's not available for recycle. Okay. That's something that you can infer. And that's also common knowledge, by the way. If you recycling means that you're going to, you use it again. If you burn it, you're not going to use it again. Okay. Again, you can get the same thing with the logic. The main conclusion is that the amount of ash generated this year will be reduced to half of that last year's total if I generate half as many if I send half as many truckloads. Okay. So your falsification question is, you can see the conclusion here. It's worded a lot more properly. And you can see how we'll send half as many truckloads. We'll recycle the remaining. And last year, everything was burned. Burning generated a lot of ash. So my falsification question is, under what conditions will the ash generated be greater than 50%? Why? Because we want to break the conclusion. Even if I only send half as many truckloads. The only possible scenario is if the ash generated per truckload is higher this year than what it was last year. So if this is my breakdown scenario or falsification scenario, my assumption is this doesn't happen. The ash generated per truckload is similar to or lower than what it was last year. Okay, so which is choice D is my correct answer. Choice, I'm going to bring in the poll question over here. Let's just bring in the poll question to see how you guys polled. Here is they're looking for this is how you polled. Choices B, C, choices C, D, and E were very popular. I'm going to focus on those over here. So choice B talks about the cost of separation. We don't care about that. We only care about the ash. Choice C really says talks about the proportion of recyclable material and it compares it to what it was last year. Again, do we know what was the proportion last year? No, we don't know what was the proportion last year. And hence the comparative part is irrelevant. Why? Because I'm only going to get half as many truckloads for incineration. That's given to me as a factual piece. Choice D talks about the amount of ash per truckload that is incinerated, which is in line with our pre-thinking and is the correct answer. We already talked about why that is the correct answer. If you want to negate this, you're going to really find that the conclusion breaks down. We already did that. Choice E talks about the total quantity of refuse. We also addressed that. The total quantity of refuse is irrelevant. Why? Because I'm only going to send half as many truckloads for incineration, even if I collect 10 times as much refuse. Okay. Now, can you really see if you pre-think, the clarity that it brings overall helps you get to the correct answer a lot more quickly? And the other thing which is there is, and that's kind of the clarity that you need. And that's why you need to do pre-thinking before you start looking at the answer choices. If you start looking at the answer choices, man, you can throw pre-thinking out of the window. So how do we go? Where do we go from here? The first thing that I want to make sure you guys understand is that this isn't rocket science. Yes, this is a skill that you need to develop. Yes, you can't think as fast as I do today, but with practice you can. Okay, you can think as fast as I do. And if you do pre-thinking, you're going to find that not only will your accuracy go up, your time to answer questions will also go down. So as next steps, if you have not gone through the concept files in the free trial, go through them. It'll take about, each concept file is about 25 minutes or so. And again, each concept file will give you personalized feedback. That's really important. If you are a paid student, make sure that you go through it in a logical fashion. Start with the foundation, with master comprehension, then go through the premise and conclusion modules, understand how an argument is built, then go through the inference module, understand what do statements mean. That will give you the right foundation. It will tell you when you read a single statement, how can you draw 4 or 5 inferences out of it. Then we'll combine that knowledge with how a conclusion, how an argument is built, and go through the inference module. In each of these modules, these are what we call as core modules, you'll get multiple concept files. Each of these files has an evaluation. The technology that we built ourselves to make sure that we evaluate you while you're watching a video will give you feedback over there. Each of these modules has multiple application files as well as multiple practice quizzes. So you will get feedback as you're doing things well. Or if you're not doing well, it'll ask you to take them again. In fact, one thing which we're very data driven. So we used to have OG quizzes, right? Along with this, we've actually removed them. Why? Because statistically, we did not find any correlation between people doing the OG quizzes and not doing the OG quizzes. Okay, but use these assessments very judiciously. Take the feedback from this. Overall, just in the learning phase, you'll get about 100 feedback points over there. And then you go through Rhenium. And this is an architecture that's designed to ensure learning. Why? Because you learn the concepts, you get feedback on the concepts, you learn the application, you get feedback on the application. And not just that, you have qualifying exercises at a modular level, not just at a CR level, but within CR about 14 points in 14 modules over there. If you are a paid student, this is what your screen looks like. Okay, so for those of you who are worried about some quant related questions, we have a separate concept on quant. We have a separate concept on segments. We have a separate concept on arguments in which there's comparison. So that you broaden, you build that ability to think. For those of you who are saying we can't think as quickly, these will help you think as quickly overall. So you learn the core concepts, level 1 application, level 2 application. Each of these there's an assessment. This is a fresh account, so you don't see the assessments over here. And there's practice right after that. And so overall in this, you'd see about 50 arguments. This is just the learning part, not the practice part, by the way. But here again, you'll see those 50 arguments. So how do you get those 100 points, or how do you get to that 90th percentile? You solve every question using pre-thinking. You let timing come automatically. Focus on the process. You're going to find that the reduction in timing happens automatically. You practice the official questions when they're recommended. And even when you make a mistake, make sure you look at the detailed solutions. Understand why you made a mistake. Even when you get a question correct, still review the solution. Make sure that you get it right for the right reasons. And yes, this webinar is being recorded, yes. So just to really tell you how much feedback you get and how does it compare to some of the other resources that you have, you can really see the amount of stuff over here. And one thing is, just because it's that comprehensive, I would discourage you to really practice from anywhere else. You frankly don't need any other resource. Here's an example of a student who scored a V46, which is a 99th percentile on GMAT verbal. She started with a V32, and within 20 odd days, she was able to improve to a V46. And the key to success was focus. Okay, with that, let me take some questions. I'm going to clear all answers on the short answer pod. I'm going to ask for some feedback on the webinar while I take some questions over here. So if you can give me feedback on the webinar, let me hide this over here, give you the session PDF. But if you can give me feedback on the webinar in the short answer pod on the right, that would be great. Let's look at the questions over here. So Chaudhary says, going through these doesn't stick well. I'm struggling. Once you've seen the question, I know the answer next time, how to avoid this issue. Look at fresh questions, and there are enough fresh questions on the EGMatt platform. Okay. Swati says in the refuse question, what if the other half is only the other half is recyclable? They won't keep the garbage in the city. Well, they might put it in landfills. They might not recycle it, but the question really is they won't send it for incineration, Swati. If you have 3 months to prepare, again, please don't put questions in the short answer pod. Put them in the Q&A webinar. If you have 3 months to prepare, then should you just go Scholaranium? Use Scholaranium? No, 3 months is plenty of time, first of all. Scholaranium is a practice platform, not a learning platform. Essentially, we say once you hit 70th percentile ability, that's when you need to go to Scholaranium. Okay. If you want to figure out the areas where you need help with, then essentially make sure that you take a Sigma X mock. Let me just send you a link to the Sigma X mock. Here is a link to the Sigma X mock over here that you guys can, it should be popping up on your screen. If you need help with creating your study plan, you can go to gmatplanner.com and create your study plan overall. Is that a computer adaptive test? Yes, Shamik, it is a computer adaptive test, yes. So here is where you can get help to prepare. Okay, guys, questions in the Q&A pod. All right, Q&A pod is the one on the left bottom left-hand side. How do you stay motivated to get past bad performances? Previous GMAT exam. I mean, is something that I'll tell you. First is watch debriefs on GMAT Club, and if you're not connected with us on our YouTube channel, connect with us on our YouTube channel. Why? Because you'd see upwards of 100 debriefs or so that are over there. Let me send you the link to our YouTube channel, and in this you're going to really find out people who've improved from really low scores to really high scores. So herein you can really see over here. Okay. When should I know that you need math to solve a CR question? You don't need math, you need logic. So if you see information that can be expressed in a logical fashion. If you're an EGMatt student, go to quant-based CR concept files. Is 2 weeks a good time period to score 740 plus? In 2 weeks, you can probably improve by about 50 to 60 points. There are many people who've done that, who've achieved that kind of improvement. Here is one guy who did that improvement. So yes, you can definitely do that. How do I not miss pre-thinking all possible scenarios? You don't, spend more time while you're in the learning phase. However, as you go into the exam mode of solving questions, at that point in time, just worry about coming up with one assumption. As I said, pre-thinking is thinking one assumption in 15 seconds before you start looking at answer choices. So you don't need to worry about all scenarios. Once you understand the logic, you see the answer, even if it's another assumption statement, you're going to find that you'd be able to select that. Okay. I'm concerned about whether the test center would be closed. Okay. Most test centers are closed. So and the GMAT will tell you when the test centers open up again. So yeah. So there's no reason to be concerned. Call the test center, call Pearson VUE, and you'd get to know that. What's the ideal time to answer a CR question? It depends on the question type. It depends on your speed. So it depends on what your tuck time is. Different people have different tuck times when it comes to answering CR questions. But for most of them, you're going to find between 90 seconds to 140 seconds or so. Uncertain about an MBA. Again, you have to figure out why you want to do an MBA. That's something which is really important. Yes, these are times are a bit uncertain, but this is temporary. Like every recession, this is going to get by. This is what I call as a minor recession, because the fundamentals in the industry are still good once we get past the virus, right? Things should go back. Actually, things should be better than what they were. Why? Because again, the fundamentals are still very strong. Most companies today have very, very strong balance sheets. So if you look at the cash on hand with a good chunk of Dow Jones Industrial Average, if you look at the cash on hand with public companies in Europe, public companies in India and China, you're going to find it's probably at the highest level, and more than what it has been at any time in history. So cash at hand means that companies do get through bad times, and then they jump back a lot faster, or they bounce back a lot faster. What's the starting point of preparation? The starting point is to take a Sigma X mock and then build a study plan. as I stated early on in the preparation in this cycle. So if you've not taken a Sigma X mock, take a Sigma X mock. If you've not created a study plan, create that study plan. Okay. All right, guys, with that, I want to thank everyone. I did not, for some reason, get feedback from everyone, as I had hoped. If you can still provide feedback, that'd be great. What is your biggest takeaway from this webinar? I think that's kind of what I'd like to know. How does this webinar change how you approach? To trust the process. Okay, eye-opening. All right. One of the things that you're going to realize, it's not a good amount of practice. It is about following a focused approach. Okay, that's really important. If you don't have that focused approach, then you're going to find that you're going to practice hundreds and hundreds of questions, but you're still not going to improve. On the other hand, if you have a focused approach, you're going to find that the improvement happens really quickly. And this is something which you're going to see everywhere, even in math. A lot of people think they're good in math. I'm going to attend the session tomorrow to really see how, if you just know the core formula, people who are not even good in math, if you just know the core formula, you can essentially answer most 700 level questions. Okay. If you want to get that study plan, if you want to understand how to execute that study plan, attend the GMAT strategy webinar. Okay. All right, guys, with that, I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I know some of you are in India where it's 10 p.m. and I want to thank you guys for taking your time out to be with us to enrich this webinar. I enjoyed hosting this one. And I look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow in the algebra webinar. Thank you very much and happy studying.